So we're here with Ron Brown, the CEO and founder of AeroClave. Ron, why don't we start with where you started? Before AeroClave came to be, what was Ron doing? What was your day-to-day?
Well, I was a trained emergency physician. I worked in the ERs here in the Orlando area for about 25 years. And for most of my time in emergency medicine, I also served as county EMS medical director for several counties here locally.
That's great. So how did you go from being in the medical field, running as a medical director for a number of counties here in Orlando? What was that step for you where you wanted to jump into entrepreneurship? Were you always kind of the entrepreneur type?
I was. In fact, when I got out of medical school, several years into practice, I discovered that I did have this yearning to do something entrepreneurial. But as most people know, physicians don't typically have a lot of business training in their undergraduate or graduate years. So I felt like if I wanted to pursue this, then I needed to get a little bit of a business background. So I enrolled in a local MBA program. I went nights and weekends for, I think it was 3 years or so to get my MBA, which doesn't make you a businessman, but at least it gave me a little better understanding of things that I hadn't previously understood. So as in my role as EMS director, this was right in the early 2000s, and we were just coming off the SARS, or the severe acute respiratory syndrome epidemic or outbreak. And although it didn't really hit the U.S. too hard, I did notice that it had a profound impact on other parts of the world. And our close neighbor Canada lost a number of healthcare workers to that. But it also had a profound impact on the airline industry. It grounded a number of planes. They reported record losses for those years. But I think the thing that bothered me the most was the loss of life in the first responder community and the hospital workers. And probably the analogy that I could use is that when I was in med school, or a little before, this was before HIV became widely known to be a blood-borne disease. And prior to that, we all never wore gloves or did any other kind of personal protective equipment. But once we knew that there was a blood-borne threat out there, the powers that be instituted certain protective things for healthcare workers, personal protective things, glasses, gloves, mask when appropriate, things like that. But what I was seeing in the SARS episode was a totally different type of threat, in that it wasn't bloodborne, in which we had pretty adequate protection against. This was something that was airborne, and it wasn't simply something that was transmitted via large droplets like from a sneeze or a cough. This is something that had very minute particles that just exhaling, someone who is infected that exhaled could release billions of infectious particles. And as first responders, we were not really prepared to deal with that. The tricky thing about emergency medicine, and really the paramedics have it the worst, is they're called to a scene where they have very little, if any, background. They don't know what the patient's sick with, or what other family members are sick with. And way too often what would happen is they would deliver a patient to an ER, and then after all the tests are run, and maybe several days later, the fire department winds up getting a call saying, hey, remember that patient 3 days ago? Well, they turned out to have TB, or they turned out to have this or that, and you really ought to get your guys checked. Well, when I saw that, the impact that this made on Canadian healthcare workers, where not expecting an airborne threat, they did their job, they tended to these patients only to succumb from the illness. So there were a couple of thoughts running through my mind. One is that we needed to try and do something to protect the first responder group. But the other thing is, with the advent of global air transportation, I mean, what happened with the Spanish flu of 1918 could very similar happen again, only this time at a much faster rate. Back in the Spanish flu, the flu traveled around the globe via ships, troop carriers, things like that. But now you can hop on an airplane and be anywhere in the world in 24 hours. And, hundreds of millions of people traveling that way every day. So if something like the Spanish flu came back and we weren't ready for it, I mean, it could decimate everybody. So, so there were other people that were starting to pay attention to this. And some of those people were the managerial people at one of our local international airports that was in my jurisdiction. And so they called me up one day and said, hey, look, we're really concerned that somebody who's infected with SARS might come over and, contaminate our airport, our personnel, whatever. So they asked me to assist them in establishing a quarantine facility, which we were happy to do. But during that discussion, I simply asked the question about, okay, well, we can take care of the patients that come on and off that plane. I said, but who's going to actually take care of the sick aircraft as well? Well, it met with a lot of blank stares. And so I simply just explained to them how diseases can be transmitted. There's stuff on the tray tables or on the seat belts or whatever that if that wasn't taken care of, you could get all the people off the plane that you wanted and take care of them. But unless you did something to take care of the infectious agents on the plane, you're just going to infect all those healthy people that are getting ready to come back on. So I knew there had to be some way to do this. So in my mind, it was relatively simple in that, well, we know that we can sterilize surgical instruments and other things like that by raising the temperature and relative humidity and in some cases the pressure, but and that viruses, which is what SARS was as opposed to a bacteria or a chemical, that they are relatively easier to kill than certain other organisms. And so my thought was if we could find a way to create those autoclave conditions on the inside of an aircraft, that we could sterilize the inside aircraft, and that would be, a lot better than hoping that people would, because the way it was done then, and still in many parts of the world it's done still, is they'll put people in, protective gear and, typically lower paid hourly wage people, and instruct them to go in and wipe down all the surfaces. Well, I thought that was not the best way to do it for a number of reasons. One is that you don't really know what the threat is, so you don't know whether your level of protection is adequate. You're asking people to go in, many of whom have family and dependents, go in there and possibly risk their lives in taking care of something that could be done in a much simpler and safer way. So, so I started doing research at that point, and number one, I wasn't even sure that you could take the inside of an aircraft up to the temperature that it needed to be. So, so we left that meeting, that first organizational meeting at the airport, and I simply asked them, I have one thing that I'd like you to check, and that is find out who's responsible for cleaning the aircraft, and we'll meet again in a couple of weeks. So when we came back, there was a lot of confusion. There were representatives from airlines there, from the airport management, from the baggage handlers, security, fire department, everybody. And everybody thought it was their job. Well, it's the cleaners of the plane, it's the fire department to come in a iffy situation, yada, yada, yada. But the bottom line is that nobody had any idea. And nobody wanted to accept that responsibility for, understandable reasons. So I said the other part of that question was, can you please find out from the FAA what their recommendations are? And so we met 2 weeks later and came back, and again, everybody, well, it's their responsibility. Well, it wasn't going to work. But the people that checked with the FAA said, well, their recommendation is now, and has been for a very long time, to basically put people in protective gear and have them go in there with approved disinfecting agents. And it's a very limited number that are approved to use in aircraft for obvious reasons, and have them wipe down every surface. So that kind of validated my thought that there's got to be a better way. So left that meeting and said, first thing I need to do is try and talk to somebody in the aviation industry and say, hey, I think the plane needs to go up to this temperature. I can't do that. Well, believe it or not, I mean, it took me almost a year and a half to get somebody from the aircraft manufacturer, I won't say which, to call me back and give me the number. And the number was remarkably higher than I thought. So well above the range that I needed to be in. So at that point, I'm like, okay, well, I know the plane can take it. I know that, viruses die at this temperature. And so now we got to figure out a way to raise the inside of the plane to that temperature. Well, so that's when I decided that there was a business opportunity here, and I started AeroClave as a privately owned LLC. I had a couple of early partners in it that had different levels of expertise and things. And so we started selling shares in the company to raise money. And at first it was kind of an idea on a napkin head, on the back of a napkin. And then it was, okay, well, we need to build a prototype. We need to find a test aircraft to test it on. And so all these things were just, one more little hurdle to jump over. Well, fortunately, things started moving along fairly quickly. And the initial team had some great ideas, and we all worked very well together. And all of us who are involved are still working our full-time jobs. I mean, I worked full-time as a physician. We just started our 23rd year in August. But for the first 10 years of AeroClave's existence, I continued to work full-time in medicine. So
let's talk about that for a minute. You see a gap in the market that nobody wants to take ownership over the role of actually disinfecting things, and taking that ownership would mean that they have that liability of
Correct.
being in charge. When you saw that opportunity, as a lot of entrepreneurs that are out there have those moments where they see gaps in the market, and you were making that decision, you were balancing working a full-time demanding job while also starting and founding a company, which is very demanding as well. Could you dig a little bit into what that mindset was when you were building both, and how you maintained, being able to operate at a high level in both of those arenas during those early days?
Well, fortunately, the job I had in medicine was on a relatively fixed schedule. So I knew days I was going to be off. I worked a lot of nights and weekends and things. As things progressed and we had to start moving into testing the device, and these are days-long tests, that can run up to a week at a time, I used all of my vacation time to be able to do that. And similarly, my early partners did the same thing. They were all balancing jobs, and so fortunately we were able to kind of patch together enough coverage to have the people that we needed to have at the location that we needed to have. But it was exhausting. I mean, it was exhausting only because, not only are you working with other people's money, which I took very seriously, but also it had never been done before. And after we started this, maybe we're a year or two into it, I guess, we discovered that there were 12 other companies who were attempting to do the same thing. They had heard, some of them had responded to the SARS epidemic, but some of them had heard that the military was interested in this. And so, as it turned out, there were 12 other companies who were trying the same thing, and half of those companies were Fortune 500 companies. So when I learned that, it was like, what am I doing here? I am just a peon. And but as fate would have it, we were very successful in the early development testing. It caught the eyes of certain people who encouraged us to go further and further. And so then all of a sudden we got a call from the FAA, and the FAA, for obvious reasons, had a vested interest in seeing something like this come to fruition. And they had actually initiated what they call one of their centers of excellence. They had created this Airline Cabin Environmental Research Center of Excellence based out of Auburn University in Alabama. And so I get a call from the director of the program up there, and he said, hey, we've heard about what you're doing, and we'd like to come down and talk to you. Well, the one nice thing that we had that nobody else had at the time was we had a full-size test aircraft. And we came upon that very fortuitously, and I was looking for a place to stage these tests. Obviously, we needed to be at some aircraft. Went down to our Orlando International Aircraft, knew the fire chief down there, so let's get in the car and drive around, see if we can find a place to do this. And as we're driving down, you just so happen to notice that there are a number of aircraft lined up, and there's a large mechanical excavator with a claw on it that's actually tearing them apart on the runway, shredding them. So they're decommissioned aircraft, and after they harvest all the useful stuff off it, then they just scrap it for the value of the aluminum. Well, I said, stop. And the guy stops the car in the middle of the taxiway there. I jump out of the car and go running over there and the guy's like yelling at me, you can't do this, you can't run out of. But I mean, I just kind of got so excited and lost all perspective, but ran up, knocked on the door of the excavator and said, hey, please stop for a minute. Well, the airline that was paying to have this done came out, and they weren't very happy. What are you doing? But it was very interesting because these were all the maintenance guys, and I don't want to mention the airline's name, but they have a big maintenance operation in Orlando. And so the guys that came out to talk to me were maintenance-based guys. And they said, what the heck are you doing? So I explained to them, and they just immediately loved the idea. And they said, well, what can we do to help? And I said, well, you can maybe not scrap that last plane. We could use it. So they did. Initially, they rented the aircraft to us, and then we later bought it. But that's the one thing that really kind of set us apart early on, is that we had a full-blown, recently decommissioned aircraft with all the pieces and parts on it. And so it made the testing a lot more realistic. So the FAA comes down, sees what we're doing, and asks us to join their Center of Excellence. And as part of that, they would foot the cost of all the test validation, which was hugely expensive. And so we were just to focus on building the equipment, running the test, and so we said, sure, we'll do that. So a couple of years of that, we did what we could do on this. It was a DC-9 aircraft, which is a smaller commercial jet airline. But the FAA had, at one of their training facilities, they had a decommissioned 747. And so they said, we'd like to see if you can scale this up to larger aircraft. So this was out in Oklahoma City. And so we packed up all our stuff, took out, and fortunately had a 100% success on the test. First try. And while we were there, Homeland Security had a similar operation in the nearby area where they had rail cars and things like that they were concerned about. So they asked us, hey, before you go home, can you see if you can do this on a rail car? We did, another 100% success. So we were feeling pretty good about ourselves. And so after another several months and stuff, we'd completed all the requirements. And the FAA doesn't certify things like what we do, but we met all the criteria that they said we'd have to meet in order for the airlines to allow this to be done on their aircraft. And so we're thinking, okay, we're going there. We're just going to sit by the phone and watch all these airlines call us up, and we'll be living off the fantail of our yacht here pretty soon. But I was very naive at that point and didn't really realize that even though the airlines were declaring all these losses from SARS and from other similar events, but it really wasn't out of pocket for them, because the U.S. government, who wanted the airlines to stay in business, would typically write them checks to mitigate their losses. So there wasn't a huge, wasn't really a huge need for the airlines to go out and spend money on something like this. So here we've gone through like 5 or 6 years now. I have a lot of money invested, a number of shareholders now, and commercial airlines didn't care about it at all. They said, well, we'll use it if the government tells us we have to use it, but we're not going to pay for it. So I was very discouraged at that point, but shortly thereafter, I get a call from someone at the Department of Defense, and particularly the Air Force. And through their networking with FAA, and they had been following our stuff, and they said, we'd like to come down and talk to you. Okay. So we met at our facility, and they said, the only thing different about what you do and what we hope to do is the organisms that we're going after are not simple viruses. They're complex, spore-forming, hard-to-kill agents. Specifically, anthrax was their big concern. And so you'll have to try and modify your system to try and get up to these conditions. Well, those conditions were really knocking right at the door of what the aircraft could maintain. And so if we overshot the mark, even in one location in the plane, we could do some serious damage to the plane or its equipment. So the trick there was, how do you raise the entire aircraft, which is typically very poorly insulated, but how do you raise the entire thing from nose to tail in a equal, without having hot spots and cold spots and stuff. And that's, I think, where we shined, is we had, through our programmers and other people, we had developed a very sophisticated mechanism, a feedback loop, that kept everything in balance, kept all the pieces of the equipment operating in harmony. And so we were able to gradually raise the temperature up to where it needed to be. And then we had to hold it there. And for the military, we had to hold it at that specific temperature for 96 continuous hours. And not only that temperature, but that relative humidity. And it wasn't easy, but we did it. And we never had a test failure. We never overshot the mark. We never caused any damage to the test vehicles. So, but all this testing with the military lasted about 8 or 9 years. Well, here, go ahead.
So you started with the idea on commercial aircraft,
Right?
And the thought process is that obviously they would want to use it for themselves to protect
Right.
The passengers, and do it as a loss mitigation on lost travel time. And when you had that initial setback of, wow, because I know a lot of entrepreneurs go through this, where you build something with a specific customer in mind, and then it turns out that customer really isn't that the person that really wants it. They say they want it, but in reality,
Until you have them write a check.
yeah, they don't want to cut that check. So when the military came around, you guys were already 7-10 years into the development on the AeroClave?
Yeah, about that. Yeah, 7-8 years. Yeah.
So, and at that same time, you were also developing another different product as well. So you
Correct.
had the main AeroClave unit for planes, which we started getting into what the military started having you work on, which I 100% want to circle back on, but I don't want to lose the other side of the business as well.
Sure.
Could you talk a little bit about that, where that falls into the timeline?
Well, yeah, I do, and I need to back up a minute to talk a little bit about the SARS thing, and the way that the airlines declared these losses was not customers suing them or anything like that. The way that this was dealt with back then was if there was a thought of an infected aircraft, somebody with SARS, the local health officials would come out and obviously get everybody off the plane. But then the local health system manager, whoever that might be in that jurisdiction, and remember, this is happening all over the world, says, okay, well, if the safest way to deal with this is we know that viruses have a limited lifetime unless they have a human host. So if we can park this aircraft for 3 days, 5 days, and it went everywhere from 3 days to 3 weeks, then at the end of that time, there shouldn't be anything alive left on the aircraft. So you take a plane that might be doing 5 or 6 revenue generating flights a day and you park it for 3 weeks, that's a huge loss of revenue. And so our thought was, hey, we come out, hook it up, and if you're going after viruses, maybe it only takes a day, we can get the plane back in the air after a day or two. So that's where the money saving, that's where the value proposition was. With the military, it was totally different in that with the military, they only have a certain amount of planes in certain classes. And, if they're in the middle of something, an operation, they can't afford to just ground all these planes. They've got to figure a way to get them back up into the fight quickly. So the needs were different between that. But and to get back to your point about how the other side of the business developed. So at the end of all the FAA testing, and this is before the contract with the government, with the military, we were very proud of ourselves. We wanted to announce, hey, we passed all these hurdles, FAA. So we staged a media event down at the airport. And we invited the governor of Florida at that time, who was Jeb Bush, and he brought all his emergency personnel with him. And they were all very nice, very impressed. But at the end of the day, they said, Dr. Brown, this is great, but as the governor of Florida, I don't really have any response. I don't own a lot of planes. But what we do have is we have a lot of rescue vehicles that, because of hurricanes and mutual aid agreements with surrounding states, we have stuff that gets exposed to a lot of bad stuff. And we don't want them to be bringing that stuff back into the state of Florida. So is there anything that you can do for our vehicles? So it was a different technology in that we use heat and humidity for aircraft, but we were also working with a certain disinfectant agent in our early FAA did. So I said, well, we'll come up with something. So what we did at that point is we developed a drive-in facility for ambulances and police cars and things like that they could drive into this facility that we built, and we would aerosolize the sterilant inside the chamber for a certain period of time, and then it would be completely sterilized inside and out. And so that's how the commercial side of the business got going. And ultimately, we realized that, well, yeah, it's easier to control if you build this facility, but now people have to bring their vehicles out of service to us, or you might have one in Orlando, but the need's down in Miami. So we decided to move more towards portable equipment that could either be mounted directly in the vehicle or could be placed in the vehicle. And so that's how all the commercial stuff got started. And, it was obviously successful at some point. We're in all of the largest 10 fire departments in the United States. We're in agencies in all 50 states in the United States. We're in, I think, 8 or 10 different foreign countries that are all using AeroClave equipment. So I think we found a niche, and but that whole development story was a little bit different. While we're trying to jump through the hurdles for the military on the aircraft, the first years of the commercial stuff were really more education, trying to explain to the first responders and their chiefs and stuff why they needed to do this, why, and fortunately, there had been a number of scientific studies that looked at, how dirty is the back of an ambulance, how germ infested is the fire station, and things like that. And so they all understood that, hey, other than us scrubbing something down 10 times a day, we're working in a pretty hostile environment. And so, so right around that time, just as we kind of spread that education around the industry, there was the Ebola outbreak. Well, there's nothing scarier than to see somebody who might be dying of Ebola. It's a very ugly way to go. And there's been enough movies about it and everything else that people knew what was coming. And so, fortunately, all these people that we had reached out to before picked up the phone and said, we got to have this. So that's how the sales started in AeroClave. But then, of course, when COVID hit, it blew the lid off of everything. And, we did keep up with the demand, but it was a challenge. But we sold thousands and thousands of units, not just to U.S. providers, but all over the world. So, so as a physician, it's great to be able to take somebody who's sick and through a team effort, help to heal that person. But to me, it's even more gratifying to develop something that might keep people from getting sick to begin with. And so that's really what the mission of AeroClave is trying to develop something that's reasonable cost, simple to use, adaptable through a number of different modalities, and obviously, doesn't harm the vehicle or the people that are using it. And so there were a lot of things that it had to meet the mark. And I think in most cases, I think we did that. We're still selling them today.
So you're talking about like they were happening at the same time though. So while what was the commercial side started when it was at that influx when the governor came and all of those people came. So while you're endeavoring on the new solution for the military, you're also endeavoring on this whole other solution for commercial.
Really, I mean, in reality,
it's like two completely different businesses.
It is two. I mean, it's different markets, it's different chemistries, different methodologies, and along the way, we actually had serious considerations about splitting the company into two separate entities. But for various reasons, we didn't, and it seemed to work out fine.
Well, that's great. So let's jump back to the military side. So do your big conference, the military reaches out, and they have these very specific boxes they want you to check. So how did that development process start, taking what was the original version of the AeroClave, which was, I believe, mounted to one of the doors of the aircraft?
Correct.
And then transitioning it to what the military wanted, which was more of a encapsulation of the aircraft.
So, and at first they really didn't care about the encapsulation of the aircraft. They just wanted to be able to raise the conditions inside the aircraft to these specific numbers. And as I mentioned earlier, an aircraft is not really well insulated, particularly military cargo aircraft. I think it's very poorly insulated. So the problem that we were running up against was these things shed heat like crazy. So as fast as we were putting the heat and humidity into the aircraft, it was shedding it just like a sieve. And so we were able to demonstrate that, yes, we could get it to those conditions, but without some sort of insulative material, it's not going to be very smooth. So the first step of this was, we did a lot of development on our DC-9 down in Orlando, but the time came where they said, well, now we want to try this on military aircraft. So they had C-130 up at Little Rock Air Force Base in Arkansas, And they said, we want you to do it up there. And as part of this test, we're going to pay another company to come out and wrap the aircraft in some insulative material. Okay, well, that's great. I'll make it easy. Well, the reality of it is what they wrapped it with was a little more than bubble wrap, had very little insulative value. And in order to attach it to the aircraft, thank goodness it was decommissioned. I mean, they put a zillion rivet holes through the skin of the aircraft. And obviously that wasn't going to work. So at the end of that test, I said, look, it's not practical to try and wrap an individual aircraft. I said, how about we surround that aircraft with an insulated structure where you just back it in and close the doors, and now you're doing the inside and the outside. So they were very, very enthusiastic about that idea. And so they said, okay, we're going to put out a request for a proposal, and unfortunately it has to go to everybody who's interested about designing a system like this. And we thought that was a little unfair because, hey, we did all the legwork on this. We had patents pending on it, but you can't argue with the military. And so they submitted the RFP. It's very detailed, and so we came up with this concept as far as the enclosure, where it was portable, it could be relocated to other facilities, and it simply just opened up like a clamshell. You back the aircraft in, close it up, and now you've got the whole thing. So kind of a gutsy call, really, that this is what we proposed, but we never had tested a prototype like this. Even though, I mean, when I first saw the design, I'm like, there's no way that's going to work. But they assured me that it would, and so we took the chance, and that's what we bid. We were awarded the contract. It was a sizable award, and the Air Force decided they wanted 5 of these systems. They called them JBADS. Of course, the military has an acronym for everything. In this case, it stands for Joint Biological Agent Decontamination System, or JBADS. And the reason that they wanted it portable was they determined that as far as military transport aircraft, the one that was probably most at risk for being contaminated was the C-130. And that is because, it goes in closer to the front lines than most of their other big transports. But the big flaw or the big problem with that aircraft is most of them, there's a few specialized versions, but most of them don't have the ability to refuel in midair. So if it was contaminated, say in Southeast Asia somewhere, even if we had a facility set up in the United States, it couldn't make the hop all the way over. And there's other geopolitical reasons why it would have. So what they insisted on was this thing had to be transportable, where it could be broken down like a Lego set and then moved via a certain number of aircraft to the site. And then we, as the contractor, would set it up and operate it through the decon cycles. So there's a lot of steps in a military production contract, and so it was a very, very tight schedule, but we stayed on schedule, we stayed on budget, and at the end of the day, we completed the mission to build 5 of these things, design it, build it, successfully test it, prove it, and then build 4 additional ones, and that was completed at the end of 2024. So there's other parts to our contract that, because this is a contractor owned, it's a government owned, but contractor maintained and contractor operated, we have to maintain the equipment. So periodically, we go out to where the equipment is and we, tear it all apart, go through it. But if they actually have to deploy to an actual situation, we deploy with the equipment and we operate it. So JBADS, as the name implies, was directed at biologic threats. And when they first, the military's been talking about decontamination from biologic and chemical threats for 60, 70 years. They just never got anywhere on it. So when they started trying to put together this request for proposal, there was a point where they decided, okay, well, we want both chemical and biologic capability. Well, their scientists were telling them, hey, biologics, not easy, but doing chemicals at a whole nother level. And very little was known about how to neutralize these chemical weapons. So they decided to break it out, make the first part of this biologic, and then once we had that, that if possible, we were to design the equipment with the capability of being slightly modified to then be able to neutralize chemical weapons. And that's where we are today. We have a contract to make modifications to the existing JVADS equipment to be able to neutralize chemical weapons. And our preliminary testing has gone incredibly well, certainly exceeded my expectations. And so what they thought might wind up being an additional 6 to 10 years worth of development, we'll probably have ready to field in well under 2 years. We're that far ahead. So things are looking good.
So what was that shift for you guys as you were bookending the contract and you were wrapping up what was a 7-8 year contract to develop the JBADS equipment? As you were wrapping that up, were you guys already with the chemical agent in mind, saying, okay, let's start working on this next challenge that we're faced with?
Yeah, yes. And we had known from the very outset that the Air Force was very interested in biologic decontamination. But the rest of the military, not so much so. They felt, well, we have just ways of dealing with it, antibiotic, whatever. But what all the other branches were very concerned about was being able to get rid of the chemical stuff. And so they told us at the outset, hey, the first piece of this is going to be bio. Probably the only people who are really going to care about are the Air Force. But if you guys can figure out a way to do chem, then there's a lot of interest out there. So as we were developing JBADS, we always had it, as kind of a side thing that let's make sure if we do this, that it's not going to prohibit us from some part of the chem thing. So, so a lot of great ideas, a lot of great brainstorming sessions and stuff. But in the interim, as we're just coming to completion on the JBADS production side of the contract, we got word that the military's own internal laboratory had tried using our same technology, elevated heat and humidity, on chemical weapons in their laboratory. And lo and behold, our technology worked on chemical stuff as well too. A little difference in how it works, in that in a biologic agent, when we're heating everything up, we're killing all the organisms in place. We're not vacuuming them out. We're not sucking them out. It's just killing it right in place. With a chemical agent, there's nothing to kill. You have to eliminate it from that thing. And chemical agents, a lot of times, adhere to the surfaces of whatever they, be it a tank or an aircraft or whatever. And it gets into the paint and to the other materials and it absorbs in there. So the way that our technology works in this case is that the elevated heat and humidity causes these substances to come out of the materials, that it causes them to off-gas out. But now they're up circulating in the air. Well, you can't just exhaust that to the environment because it's a live agent. So what's different about the chem side of this is the way you get rid of those is first you have to lift them off the item that's contaminated, but then you have to filter them out of the air. And so we had to design, with the help of other people that are really experts in this field, a pass-through filter system that we can, as we're recycling this air, that we have some way to run it through the filters that'll trap it, and then return the vast majority of that. But at the same time, we have to keep the entire envelope airtight. You just can't have anything leaking out. So you're pumping massive volumes of air into this structure that if you weren't able to control the pressure inside the structure, it'd be leaking from every little, nook and cranny. Well, part of our system is that we always operate slightly negative. So we assume that you cannot make something 100% airtight, but it's better to be able to suck some outside air in and treat that rather than having bad stuff seep out. So we operate under slightly negative pressure where we're, pulling in a little bit more than we're putting back out. And so that keeps the entire enclosure airtight, I guess. And so that's so where we are now is we've made the modifications. We've got the prototype of the filtration module, and we've done preliminary tests on a smaller scale structure, and now we're ramping up to full size. So as part of that effort, just like we used a C-130 on the JBAD side of it, the military has given us a Black Hawk helicopter to use as a demonstration test vehicle for this. So we have a smaller enclosure that's large enough for 2 rotorcraft or a bunch of ground vehicles or whatever. But that's what we'll be finalizing the product on.
So that's great. I know that there was a recent deployment of the JBAD's light product.
Right.
Do you want to talk a little bit about what that was for? What spurred that on?
So while we were still testing things down at Orlando International Airport, and this is after the military contract had been initiated, the military came to us and said, hey, look, we had this kind of one-off situation. We have a C-130 out in Colorado that's been heavily infected with mold. Somebody left the hatch open, it rained, and then it just sprouted mold to the point where the maintainers, they call them, the mechanics, can't even go inside the aircraft without getting sick. So, and what's of particular importance of this aircraft is there's a very small number of C-130s that have this retrograde kit installed in them that allows them to function as a wildfire aerial tanker. And so there's a squadron of these out in Colorado. Well, there was only 6 of them in the squadron, and this one got infected. They said, we're coming up on wildfire season. This thing needs to be able to fly. Can you help us? So we said, well, yeah, that should be relatively simple. So they flew the aircraft into Orlando. The military lab personnel came down, did pre and post testing, found some very interesting things, what else was inside this aircraft, because it had been all over the world. And so at that point, we hooked up to all the exterior hatches and everything, and we ran the cycle for 24 hours. Well, shorter than that, because it was literally 24 hours from the moment they landed the aircraft until the time the crew came out and got back on a clean aircraft and took it back to Colorado. So we were able to prove that we could rapidly mitigate mold inside an aircraft. And it is, believe it or not, mold in an aircraft is a huge problem for a number of reasons, not just in the military, but in commercial aviation as well. So they started calling that process where we just did the interior only of an aircraft as a JBAD's light performance, whatever. So the lab that came down did a nice write-up, and he published it, and yada, yada, yada. Well, fast forward to early last year, and we get a call from Tyndall Air Force Base, and they have 2, not 1, but 2 of their AWACS Sentry aircraft, the thing with the big radar dome on the top, that have a incredible mold problem. Well, as few C-130s there are for firefighting, there is an extremely limited number of these very, very expensive AWACS aircraft available. They're flying all the time, 24/7. They're always in the air. So to have not one, but two of them grounded with this was just a huge problem for the military. So they called us and said, hey, can we do a repeat on that? Sure. So we sent all our equipment and crews out there, and within 2 weeks, we got both aircraft back up in the air with zero damage, and at a fraction of the cost of what they had determined. If they used traditional methods, what it would cost them. I don't want to tell you the numbers, but it was unbelievable difference between what we charged them and what it would have cost them if they'd done it. So really now there's even, you never want to invent something that's only going to be used once in a lifetime, or in case there's some drastic emergency. And that's no different with what we're doing. Just on the commercial side, our goal is we want to see the back of an ambulance deconned after every patient transport. Well, with the aircraft, we want to be able to do those on a more regular basis as well too. But we don't want it to be just used if there's an anthrax outbreak. So again, there's so many people that have input into something like this. I mean, I'm not the only person that's directing all this, but as we've come to find out, the bacteria, mold, and other microbial organisms are actually responsible for about 20% of corrosion in all aircraft. Well, there's nothing that puts fear in the heart of an aircraft owner more than the word corrosion. You think of all the structural stuff that can happen. So just in the U.S. military, just in the Air Force, they spend about $6 billion a year trying to control corrosion. And about 20% of that, or 1 point something billion, and 1.2 billion of that, they say is due to this microbial influenced corrosion. Well, the beauty of our process is sterilize the entire aircraft inside and out, including the fuel tanks, the fuel lines. Everything is surgically sterile at the end of our procedure, without having to take all these access panels off or have people climb into these hell holes. And so it's a very attractive proposal to say, we don't know how often it ought to be done. Should it be done once a year or whatever? But we do know that all large aircraft, all aircraft, have very regular maintenance schedules, and whether it's every 3 years or every 5 years, they undergo these really heavy-duty maintenance where they basically strip the aircraft down. So the discussion at this point is, should the JBADs become part of regular heavy maintenance? Is it good enough to do it once every 3 years, every 5 years, or whatever? So that makes it much more of an attractive proposal to say, well, you know what? Maybe we should have some of these things all around the country. And certainly what happens in military aircraft happens in commercial aviation as well too. If you remember, I mentioned the Ebola outbreak. Well, from an aircraft standpoint, there was a case where there was a suspected Ebola patient on a commercial aircraft flight. I think it was from Minnesota to Texas or something like that. But once they found out, they got everybody off the plane, but nobody really knew what to do with the aircraft. And so the airline flew it out to their maintenance facility out in Colorado, where they not once, but 3 times hired professional cleaners to come in, clean the thing from stem to stern. But then, according to the story that I was told, management was still not convinced that this would eliminate their liability. So they actually tore out a section of the interior where this suspected patient was, and redid it all, new seats, carpets, everything. Well, I mean, millions of dollars were spent, and the plane was out of service for months. Well, this could have been as simple as hooking up JBADs, and you would have had the plane back in 48 hours. And that's where we think this is going. We think that this is not a break glass in case of emergency type of deal, that this has real, practical, economically viable, everyday uses.
So turning it in, like almost going full circle from, originally where the commercial airliners weren't really interested, but now seeing all of the benefits and all the studies coming out, whether it's the corrosion from the microbes or just in general. I know during COVID there was a huge ordeal flying commercially where they were having to disinfect after each flight. And I'll be honest, as somebody that flies fairly often, you can feel that it's not as clean as it was during COVID. So it's interesting to think about, like, adding something like this, if it is as it becomes more cost effective for them, and as more of them see the benefit of, hey, you know what, maybe it isn't a everyday thing, but maybe it's a once a month thing for our fleet of airliners, because even if it can cut that downtime for a corrosion or a maintenance issue by 5%, 10% on a bottom line, that could be huge for a commercial airliner.
I think ultimately, where the future of this lies is, obviously, it takes us a while to transport the equipment for JBADs and set it up and make it operational. And this particular structure is sized specifically for C-130 aircraft. And so a lot of commercial aircraft aren't going to fit in that. But what it's going to take is having some of these as permanent facilities where you can have a traditional hangar door that opens up, the plane goes in, whatever size that is, and close, and so you have a much more rapid turnaround. But even if that were the case, this is not going to be an everyday thing or even an every month thing. I think what I would like to see it become is, I'd like to see it be used regularly during their heavy maintenance inspection, but also during times of an outbreak or whatever. If they have a serious consideration, then they can just fly the aircraft to this facility, put it in there, and boom, we're done. But I still think, just based on manpower and the cost of doing it, the airlines, whenever they can, are going to choose the least expensive item. And so we'll continue to see people walking down the aisle with spray cans. But at least we know that there is something available if you have to take it to the next level.
And I'm sure you guys have gone across certain locations that are very big on, like, biosecurity.
Correct.
Places like Hawaii, Australia, other places that are very sensitive about their ecosystems. I'm sure that there is a application for this in that kind of avenue as well.
There is indeed. We're actively working on a contract for that specific thing. And I won't mention the country by name, but it's a country that we have regular military exercises with, that is very, very concerned about allowing invasive species, whether that be microbial or vegetative or whatever. They're paranoid about that, and I think with good reason. And so, as part of these military exercises, the U.S. has to break down whatever they're shipping over there, whether it be Humvees or helicopters or whatever. They have to basically strip them down to the nuts and bolts and hand clean all these products and then put them back together again. Well, I mean, it doesn't take too long to figure out what's wrong with that picture. You always have a few extra bolts left over. Not sure where that one's supposed to go. But vehicles were not meant to be broken down and put back together that frequently. So it causes premature wearing on the vehicles. There's always a chance of a mishap. You forget to put this back in. But more than that, it's an incredibly time-consuming process. And it's very expensive. In this case, for this particular exercise, it takes roughly 6 months and $50 million worth of manpower to get all the equipment to the level of satisfaction of this particular government. Well, this process does the same thing without having to take everything apart. I mean, so obviously people want proof of that, and that's what we're going through now to show them that we can do that, either as a standalone with the heat and humidity, or as a hybrid system where we use some of our spray technology in addition to the heat and humidity and stuff. And I think that looks very promising because, I mean, if you look at, I mean, everything that's going on in the world from that, I mean, whether it's trying to limit the spread of swine flu or bird flu or whatever, there's a lot of threat to our food cycle, to our food system, and biosecurity. It all comes under biosecurity, but there's a real place in that for what we do, and you know, we can't be everything to everybody, but there's certain nooks or niches that are just not really well handled, and this could be an answer to that. But like any company, and we're a small company, you know, we have 25 something employees, you have limited resources, so you can only go in so many different directions at the same time. But we're growing, and as the challenges present themselves and the contract presents themselves, we'll scale up, just like we did with JBADS. When we were awarded the contract for JBADS, we were a 6-person company, and it was unheard of historically to have that size of a contract awarded to a 6-person company. But we had to rapidly build up our, so we had to go out and find the right people, and we developed a terrific team. It's still the same team, and but it's always about taking it to the next level.
Incredible. Let's wrap up with some of what you're most excited about coming down the pipeline for AeroClave, things that people should be on the lookout for, and if somebody wants to learn more, how and where should they reach out to get that information?
Well, obviously the easiest thing for further information is either go on the website or call our office, which is listed on the website, and somebody will talk to you. We always welcome visitors to come here. We're not some black site, high security thing. Obviously, we operate under military security parameters, so you can't have free reign to the place. But we've always felt that that's been very useful to have people come and lay hands on the equipment and see the equipment in operation, because it's kind of sometimes hard to wrap your head around this. So that's for more information. But the thing I'm most excited about is obviously to get the chemical certification from the military, because I think now we're talking about all the different branches of the services that are interested now. There's a large number of possibilities in Homeland Security applications, things like that. So we got to keep our eye on the ball. We got to keep going with the chemical stuff, which we think will be concluded relatively soon. And then it's really just a matter of kind of spreading the gospel, so to speak. And what I've always been so amazed in is we've been working with the military since 2008, I think, and there are still so many people in the military that have no idea what AeroClave is or what JBADS is, and one of the problems is the people are changing roles all the time. There's a constant a constant movement of personnel. And so like this thing with the AWACS where it just so happened that after they had exhausted all their internal research about, how they can do it and themselves, did somebody say, hey, I think I heard about this company somewhere that did something with the C-130s. But it was only by that luck that we got into the picture. And so that's why I think the the thing that we need to do better is we need to make ourselves. I like a joke, like, we're the world's best kept secret. So, so that's we need to do a better job marketing and spreading the news. But there's a lot of stuff opening up from a biosecurity standpoint, from a chemical weapons standpoint, from homeland security stuff. Lots of applications. So we think we have a very bright future.